Wondering how much it costs to take a cruise? I'll show you the specific estimates, which include some actual figures from the cruise companies themselves. Just like buying a car, you can spend as much or as little as you want for your cruise. For instance, if you're happy with the lowest cost interior cabin, or would you rather spend more for a balcony or a suite? Or are you the sort of person who can only sail during the summer months when prices are much higher? Or can you sail during the off season and save hundreds of dollars with lower fares? That means tracking down the specific cost of a cruise for every person isn't possible, but you can at least get an idea of what the typical trip will run and help you figure out how much you can plan to spend. So, let's get into all the details of exactly where you'll spend money and how much a cruise costs. Of course, when most people think of the cost of a cruise, they are thinking mainly of the price of the cruise fare. The fare, that's what the cruise line charges for you to sail on the ship. Cruise fares include your cabin, most meals, entertainment on the ship, and access to things like the pools and the lounges and more. Obviously, it's impossible to give you a specific cost of your specific cruise fare. There are simply so many different factors that go into what you'll pay. This includes the cruise line, the specific ship, the date of your cruise, the cabin type, and even the trip length. Sailings, they can be less than $100 per person per day into several $100s each day. That said, you can get a good idea of what you might spend. The major cruise lines, they're public companies that publish annual figures for their revenue and passenger statistics. That gives some insight into what people spend on average. From these public reports, we know that the average cost of cruise fare runs from about $150 to $220 per person per day, depending on the cruise line. For example, in 2019, the last full year of sailing, Carnival Corporation, which owns several different lines, took in $14.1 billion in ticket revenue and sailed 93.4 million passenger days. That comes out to $151 per person per day. Of course, those figures can be much lower or much higher depending on your specific cruise. For example, sailing in an interior cabin is drastically cheaper than sailing in a balcony room. And cruises departing in January or February are less expensive than those sailing at the height of summer. Still, these figures should give you a good idea of what the average cost of your cruise is based on what others pay. Port fees and taxes aren't technically part of your cruise fare, but they are included in what you pay before you board. These costs don't go to the cruise line, but they still come out of your pocket. So how much will you pay for these port fees? The amount, it varies depending on your specific route, as different ports charge different fees. In my experience, most cruises expect to spend between $100 to $200 per person on these fees and taxes for your entire trip. Some cruises with fewer ports will be less money. As a rule of thumb, the more ports your cruise visits, the higher the port fees you should expect. If you want to save here, then look for shorter trips with fewer stops. By far, the biggest expense of taking a cruise is the cruise fare, but onboard spending comes in second for most people. So how much will you spend once you're actually on the ship? Along with cruise fare, the cruise companies, they break down how much cruise passengers spend aboard the vessels within their financial reports. On average, across cruise companies, the amount comes out to around $65 to $95 per person per day. Carnival Corporation reports the lowest amount of onboard spending, while Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings, the parent of NCL, reports the highest from the reports that I analyzed. It's common to spend 30 to 40% of what is spent on cruise fare just on onboard spending. Keep in mind that this is simply an average across all cruise passengers and major cruise lines. What you spend, it could be drastically different. Onboard spending is the one area of your trip where you are in complete control of how much or how little you spend. For instance, some people, they spend little or no money once they're on the ship. Others purchase things like drink packages, or they gamble in the casino and generally live it up for the entire cruise. Gratuities are a fact of life on a cruise ship. Yes, you can adjust the amount of gratuities if your service is particularly poor, but for most of us, that's not something that's going to happen. Expect to spend about $15 per person per day. So a couple traveling on a 7-day cruise, they'll spend more than $200 on these tips. Gratuities may be slightly higher or lower depending on the cruise line. As well, guests sailing in suites have higher gratuity rates compared to the lower tier cabins like the interior or the balcony. One thing to keep in mind, this amount doesn't include the gratuities charged for extras like alcoholic beverages on the ship. Those are extra in addition to the automatic gratuities charged to each passenger that go to the waitstaff and the room steward. It's not just your cruise that costs money. There's also what you'll spend before you even get to the port. The amount that it will cost you to get to the ship, park, or a hotel stay will vary based on your needs. Some people, they live near the port and just get dropped off at the port by a friend or an Uber. Others have to book cross-country flights and a hotel stay the night before. Now, if you drive to the port, plan to spend around $20 per day for parking depending on the actual cruise port. Hotels in most cities can be found between $100 and $200 per night. And rides to the port or the cruise terminal using services like Uber or Lyft can vary considerably depending on where you're coming from. Still, you don't want to forget these considerable expenses in budgeting for your cruise. Finally, let's talk about spending in ports of call. What you spend in port can vary widely. Remember, anything you eat or drink off the ship will come out of pocket and isn't included in your cruise fare. As well, things like taxis and souvenirs are also extra costs. As a rule of thumb, I like to estimate a budget of about $50 per person per port of call. For some ports, that may be too much. For instance, a cruise line island, they often have what you need already included. Other ports, they might include a stop at a restaurant, some souvenir shopping, and buying drinks at a bar on shore. These costs can quickly add up. So what's the grand total? Adding up all of these expenses that I've covered comes to a per person estimate for what you can benchmark for your cruise. As you can see, for a 7-day cruise, you can expect to spend around $2,000 when you factor in everything. For a 5-day cruise, that figure is closer to about $1,500. A couple would expect to double these prices. Now, if those numbers seem scary, do not worry. These are just estimates, and you do have a lot of individual control over what you'll spend. For instance, sailing off-season in a lower tier cabin or on an older ship can drastically cut your cruise fare and still give you largely the same experience. In onboard spending, as I mentioned, it's the largest expense outside of cruise fare, but it is optional. You can sail without spending another dime if you want to. In other words, if you want it to be, cruising can be amazingly affordable. On the other hand, if you want to splurge on things like suite cabins and high-end restaurants, then you can spend as much as you want. The good news is, what you budget is in your control. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a better idea of what a cruise might cost you. Now, if you like this video, be sure to like it, and you can also subscribe. As well, check out our channel for more helpful videos on planning your cruise. Until next time, happy cruising.